Ready to have our minds blown by some serious brain science? Today, we're really diving deep into Dr. Carmen Simon's Made You Look, a book that I promise will completely change how you think about communication.
Yeah, and it's not just theory. Dr. Simon uses some really cool tools like EEG to actually see what's happening in the brain in real time as people experience different types of content.
It's like getting a backstage pass to the brain.
Exactly. It's about understanding what truly captures attention, not just what people think they remember, you know?
And speaking of memorable, Dr. Simon kicks things off with a story. You know how much I love a good story. It's about Max Huber, the scientist behind that luxury skincare brand, La Mer.
Oh yeah, the miracle broth cream.
That's the one. So after Huber died, the company was trying to recreate the potency of his original formula, but they just couldn't crack it. It was a total mystery.
Intriguing.
Well, it gets even more interesting. They actually brought in a medium, someone who claimed to be able to channel Huber's spirit.
Wow, okay, that's definitely not your average business strategy.
Right. And get this, through this totally unorthodox method, they uncovered two missing steps in the process. Apparently, sound and light energy played a role in the fermentation process, along with a specific type of yogurt-like culturing technique.
Wow, talk about thinking outside the box, or maybe inside the petri dish.
Right, but that's exactly Dr. Simon's point. Just like that secret La Mer formula, impactful communication has all these hidden elements, these nuances we don't always consciously recognize.
And that's where neuroscience comes in.
No.
Instead of just asking people what they remember, which we all know can be unreliable, Dr. Simon's research uses EEGs to get a direct line to the brain's immediate responses. Like, how does your brain react to that PowerPoint slide right now?
It's like peeking behind the curtain of our own minds.
Exactly. And what's even wilder is that even AI, when asked what captures its attention, you know what it brings up? Preferences, emotions, the same things that we humans sometimes struggle to even put into words.
Which just goes to show how powerful these neuroscience tools are for understanding what's really going on in those amazing brains of ours. So how do we start tapping into this power?
Well, Dr. Simon introduces this concept called priming. And it's this idea that you can actually prep your audience's brain to focus on the information that you deem important just by carefully choosing what they encounter beforehand.
So it's like setting the stage for maximum impact strategically. Tell me more.
Absolutely. Dr. Simon outlines four main types of priming: perceptual, affective, semantic, and repetition. And each one uses different mechanisms to influence how our brains process what comes next.
Okay, let's break those down. What's perceptual priming all about?
So perceptual priming, think about it like this. Sensory cues. Let's say you're giving a presentation about sustainable fabrics, right? Instead of just talking about them, imagine your slides feature these close-up images of natural fibers.
I'm picturing it like almost feeling the softness, the texture, just by looking.
Exactly. That's perceptual priming in action. You're creating a multisensory experience that just draws the audience in deeper.
Oh, I like that. Creating an experience, not just delivering information. What about affective priming?
Affective priming is all about tapping into emotions. Dr. Simon's research shows that triggering a eureka moment, that feeling of sudden insight like, aha, I get it now, can significantly increase attention and memory.
Because it feels good to figure something out.
Yeah.
And then we connect that positive feeling to the information itself.
Precisely. And one way to create these aha moments is to strategically place thought-provoking questions right before you reveal key pieces of information.
Oh, that makes so much sense. Okay, I have a question though about repetition in communication. Because I know for me personally, I sometimes feel weird repeating the same message too many times. Like I feel like I'm talking down to my audience.
I know you mean. It can feel almost a little remedial sometimes to say the same thing over and over.
Right. But on the other hand, you want to make sure people really get it.
Well, here's the surprising thing. Dr. Simon's research actually challenges that assumption. Her studies have shown that audiences really don't find repetition excessive, even when a key message is repeated several times within a short presentation.
No way. So what I'm hearing is, don't be afraid to reinforce what matters.
Exactly. Repetition, when done strategically, can be a very powerful tool for really driving home those key points.
Interesting. Okay, so this might be a little off topic, but it makes me think of that classic presentation advice. Tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them.
The famous T3 principle. I know it well.
Right. It's like the golden rule of presentations.
It really is. But, and this is a big but, Dr. Simon's research actually challenges that too.
No way, really? That's wild.
Yeah, just stating the agenda up front and then summarizing at the end doesn't actually create that cognitive closure we're looking for. Instead, she found that repeating those key points throughout the presentation, weaving them into the narrative, that's what's actually effective for memory and comprehension.
Wow, that kind of turns conventional wisdom on its head. See, this is why I love these deep dives, always learning something new and unexpected. Okay, so we've primed the brain with all these cool techniques, but what about the body? Is there a connection there?
100%. It's called embodied cognition, and it's this fascinating link between our physical selves and how we think.
Okay, break that down for me. Embodied cognition. So you're saying our bodies actually influence how our brains work.
It's a pretty revolutionary concept. Our bodies aren't just these vessels for our brains. They're actively involved in shaping our cognitive processes.
So it's not just mind over matter.
Not at all. Think about it from an evolutionary standpoint. Our survival literally depended on our ability to move.
That's true. If we couldn't move to find food or escape danger, well, we wouldn't be here.
Exactly. And that connection between movement and survival is deeply ingrained in us.
Okay, that makes sense. But it's funny because if you think about it, all of our modern conveniences, the internet, food delivery apps, they've made us incredibly sedentary.
And there's a growing body of research that suggests that lack of movement can actually hinder our cognitive abilities.
Really? So all the more reason to get up and move.
Exactly. And here's something practical you can do. Encourage note-taking. Even in our digital world, the physical act of handwriting has been shown to significantly boost memory and engagement compared to typing.
Huh, interesting. It makes you wonder about all those EEG studies where they tell participants to sit perfectly still.
Right? Because any movement can interfere with the brain signals they're trying to measure.
Yeah, it's like, how do you reconcile that with the idea that movement is actually beneficial for cognition?
A great question, and it's something researchers are actively exploring. Dr. Simon's team is actually finding new and innovative ways to incorporate movement into their studies.
Oh, wow. That's exciting.
It really is. It just goes to show you how important this whole area of embodied cognition is becoming.
So movement is important, even in something like a presentation where you're just standing in one place, basically. But how do you actually create that sense of movement, that dynamism that keeps people engaged?
That's a great question. And it all goes back to the way our brains are wired, right? We're naturally drawn to motion. Think about it. What's one of the things that keeps you glued to your seat during a 90-minute movie?
It's true. I never really thought about it like that. But yeah, I guess it's the constant movement, the changing camera angles, the characters interacting, all that visual stimulation.
Exactly. It creates this dynamic experience that keeps us engaged.
Okay, so how do we translate that to, say, a business presentation? I mean, I'm not going to be like jumping around on stage, right?
No, not at all. But Dr. Simon's research actually has some fascinating findings about this. For example, she found that the ideal length for a slide, in terms of how long our attention spans actually are, is surprisingly short.
Really? Like, how short are we talking here?
Shorter than you might think. We're talking more like the average shot length in a movie than what you typically see in presentations.
So shorter slides, more visual variety, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But it's not just about speed either. It's also about varying the amount of movement throughout your presentation, just like a good movie has its peaks and valleys, right?
Oh, I see what you mean. Like building in moments of stillness and reflection, and then moments of more intense visual stimulation.
Yes, exactly. Because when you shift the pace of information like that, it keeps your audience on their toes, so to speak. Keeps them engaged.
That makes perfect sense. I've definitely been to those presentations where every slide is just like, bam, more information, bam, more information. And by the end, my brain is completely fried.
Exactly. It's too much. Okay, what about virtual presentations? I feel like that adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing, since you're even more limited in terms of physical presence. So I've always wondered, does standing up while you're presenting online actually make a difference?
I've always wondered that too, because part of me is like, who cares? They can't even see my whole body anyway.
Right. So Dr. Simon actually did a study on this, and the results were kind of surprising.
Oh, really? Do tell.
So it turns out that while audiences did tend to rate the presenters who were sitting as more likable,
Interesting.
they actually had better recall of the information presented by the presenters who were standing.
No way, really?
Yeah.
So even though standing up might feel a little more formal, maybe a little less relatable, it actually helps your message stick in the long run.
It seems that way. Isn't that fascinating?
It really is. Okay, I want to switch gears for a second and talk about something else that Dr. Simon talks about in her book, which is this concept of the right amount of wrong.
Ooh, yes. the right amount of wrong. Love that.
Right. It sounds a little dangerous, but I'm intrigued. Are we talking about like intentionally shaking things up a bit, throwing in some curveballs to keep the audience guessing?
That's a great way to put it. It's about tapping into that part of our brains that's hardwired to zero in on the unexpected.
Because novelty grabs our attention.
Exactly. When we encounter something that challenges our assumptions, it forces us to pay closer attention, to really process that information. Think of it like this. It's like, that character Moira Rose from Schitt's Creek
Oh my gosh.
with her like totally outlandish vocabulary and over the top stuff. You can't look away. You never know what's going to come out of her mouth.
Best. So good.
Right. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. That element of surprise, that unpredictability. Dr. Simon actually outlines 6 specific ways to use what she calls provocative content.
Oh, wow. 6. Okay, so it's not just about being provocative for the sake of it, right?
Exactly.
There needs to be a purpose behind it.
Exactly. It's not about being controversial for the sake of being controversial. It should always serve a larger purpose, a deeper message.
So, like, what are some of those 6 ways?
So one is challenging the status quo. Another is questioning norms, proposing counterintuitive ideas, exposing hidden assumptions, encouraging perspective taking, and even triggering a bit of tension, a dilemma.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's about pushing people out of their comfort zones a little bit.
In a way, yes.
Hmm.
But it's all about doing it strategically right. It should always be in service of sparking thought, encouraging deeper engagement.
That makes sense. Although, I imagine some people listening to this might be a little worried about, like, using provocative content in their communication. Like, what if it backfires? What if it alienates their audience or makes them angry?
Yeah, it's a valid concern.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Some pushback is totally natural and can actually be a sign that your provocation is working.
Oh, interesting.
It means you've gotten people thinking, questioning their assumptions, which is exactly the goal, right?
Exactly.
Remember, the aim is to spark thought, not to please everyone.
It's not about being liked, it's about making an impact. I love that. Okay, so let's say we've captured our audience's attention. We've primed their brains, we've incorporated movement, we've even sprinkled in a little right amount of wrong, as Dr. Simon says. How do we keep them engaged? What comes next?
Great question. So Dr. Simon calls this next phase guided action, and one of the key elements here is variety. Think about those presentations where every single slide is just jam-packed with text and bullet points.
Ooh, the dreaded wall of text. We've all been there.
Right. Information overload is a real thing. Our brains just aren't designed to process that much information in that way.
So what's the alternative? How do we avoid that?
Variety. Our brains crave variety. Dr. Simon's research using this really cool technique called hyperscanning, which basically allows researchers to scan multiple brains at the same time.
Whoa, what? That's like next level brain science?
It really is.
Yep.
But anyway, their research showed that mixing up the types of content that you're presenting, so switching between visuals, text, stories, even incorporating interactive elements, if that's possible, it all helps to prevent habituation, which is that feeling of getting bored or zoning out.
Right, because our brains love novelty. Okay, and speaking of variety metaphors are everywhere in business especially, but are they actually effective? Or are we all just clinging to them out of habit?
That's a really good question, because some metaphors have become so overused, so cliche, that they've lost their power. It's like you hear them, you're just like, okay, yeah, I get it. You've heard it all before.
Right, it's like nails on a chalkboard. See, there's a metaphor.
Exactly. But a truly original, well-crafted metaphor that can be incredibly powerful. And Dr. Simon's research actually confirms this. Her research on how the business brain responds to metaphors found that fresh, unexpected metaphors consistently outperform those tired cliches.
So it's not about avoiding metaphors altogether. It's about being more intentional about the ones we choose, right?
Yes. Ditch the predictable, overused metaphors and really strive for originality. Find new and creative ways to create those connections in your audience's mind.
I love that. Okay, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about our brains being prediction machines. What exactly does that mean?
It's so fascinating. So basically, our brains are constantly trying to anticipate what's coming next, and this applies to everything we do. From reading a book, to watching a movie, to listening to a presentation. It's how we make sense of the world. And Dr. Simon has this great quote in her book. She says, "What will people see in their mind's eye in the future when they are not exposed to me or my materials?"
Wow, that's a really powerful question.
Right. It really makes you think about the lasting impact of your message. The echoes that it leaves behind long after the presentation is over.
Instead of just, did they get it in the moment? It's like, did it stick with them? Okay, but here's the challenge. In a world where everyone and everything is competing for our attention, how do you actually make sure that your message, your ideas are the ones that stick?
Right, because it's not just about individual attention anymore. Right.
Yeah.
And this is where Dr. Simon introduces this idea of collective attention. It's like our attention is not just our own anymore. It's shaped and influenced by the people around us.
We're all so interconnected now. It's like this web of influence.
Right. And that's why some ideas catch fire and go viral and others just kind of disappear.
Yeah.
So it's not just about crafting a message that's individually compelling. It's about understanding how that message fits into this larger social and informational ecosystem.
It's like we're all swimming in this sea of information together, and we're all influencing each other's attention.
Exactly. And it makes you realize that attention is precious, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a valuable resource that we're constantly choosing how to allocate.
And with so much vying for our attention these days, it's no wonder we're constantly being told to simplify, simplify, simplify. But I wonder, are we sometimes oversimplifying things? Are our brains actually capable of handling more complexity than we give them credit for?
That's a really interesting question. And Dr. Simon's research actually suggests that, yes, our brains can handle a lot more complexity than we might think. She uses eye tracking technology to study how people engage with complex visuals.
What happens? Do people's eyes just glaze over?
Not at all. People actually do engage with complex visuals, especially when there's some kind of guidance to help them navigate that complexity.
So it's not about dumbing things down. It's about structuring information in a way that makes it more accessible.
Yes. It's like, think about the difference between trying to navigate a really complex map all on your own versus having a knowledgeable guide who can point out landmarks, suggest pathways.
Oh, I see what you mean.
That's kind of what effective narration, clear visuals, and thoughtful design can do for us. They help us navigate complexity without getting overwhelmed.
It's like they provide a roadmap for our brains. That actually reminds me of something else Dr. Simon talks about in her book, Fractals. Have you ever heard of those?
Oh, fractals are so cool. Those patterns that repeat at different scales. Like, think of a tree branching out or the intricate design of a snowflake.
Yeah.
They're visually mesmerizing, but they're also a really powerful metaphor for how our brains make sense of information.
Really? Tell me more about that.
So Dr. Simon suggests that incorporating these fractal-like structures into the way we communicate, like repeating key themes at different levels of detail, using visuals that echo those fractal patterns, it can actually make complex information more digestible, more memorable. It's like our brains are naturally drawn to those patterns.
It's like we're tapping into something fundamental about how our brains are wired. So instead of shying away from complexity, maybe we should be looking for ways to embrace it, to structure it in a way that feels intuitive to our brains.
Exactly. And when you think about the most memorable, the most impactful communication, it often does embrace complexity, right? It challenges us to think differently, to expand our perspectives, to see the world in a new way.
I completely agree. Well, this deep dive into Dr. Carmen Simon's Made You Look has been absolutely fascinating. I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about communication in a whole new light, doesn't it?
It really does. It's about so much more than just delivering information clearly. It's about understanding how our brains actually work, how they process information, how we form memories.
Yes. It's about understanding the science of attention.
Exactly. And perhaps even more importantly, it's about recognizing the power of silence, of reflection. Dr. Simon talks about how in a world that's constantly bombarding us with stimulation, sometimes the best thing we can do for our brains, for our creativity, is to disconnect, to give ourselves space to just think.
It's so true. Sometimes the best ideas come to us when we're not even actively searching for them.
Exactly. So, to our listeners, here's a little challenge for you. Carve out some time for yourself this week. Step away from all the screens and distractions and just see what happens. What insights might bubble up when you give your brain a little bit of breathing room?
You might be amazed by what you discover.
This has been amazing. Thanks for diving in with us.
Yes, thank you.